The Maya people, whose legacy spans over 3,000 years, created a world of stunning mathematical precision, astronomical mastery and artistic brilliance that continues to captivate us today. Their story isn't just one of rise and fall, but of continuous adaptation, resilience, and cultural evolution that extends from the distant past into our present day. Picture yourself standing at the base of a towering pyramid in Tikal, its limestone steps ascending into the canopy where scarlet macaws nest among the ceiba trees. The air is thick with humidity and history, and as you climb those ancient steps, each one worn smooth by countless feet over countless centuries, you're literally ascending through layers of time. This is the world we're about to explore together. A civilization that at its height encompassed over 300,000 square kilometers across what is now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The Maya story begins long before the first pyramid was ever conceived, in a time when small groups of hunters and gatherers first began to settle in the lowlands and highlands of Mesoamerica. These early peoples, arriving perhaps as early as 10,000 BCE, would gradually develop the agricultural techniques, social structures, and spiritual beliefs that would form the foundation of Maya civilization. They weren't building grand cities yet, but they were laying the groundwork for something extraordinary. The transformation from nomadic bands to settled communities didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that unfolded over millennia, beginning in what archaeologists call the Archaic period, roughly from 7,000 to 2,000 BCE. During these long centuries, the ancestors of the Maya were learning the rhythms of their environment, discovering which plants could be cultivated, which animals could be domesticated, and which locations offered the best resources for permanent settlement. In the humid lowlands of what would become the Maya heartland, these early peoples found themselves in an environment that was both challenging and abundant. The tropical forest provided game animals like deer, peccary, and tapir, while the rivers and coastal areas offered fish, shellfish, and waterfowl. But it was the discovery and cultivation of maize, beans, and squash that would truly revolutionize their way of life. This agricultural trinity, which the Maya would later incorporate into their creation myths as the very substance from which humans were made, provided the nutritional foundation that would allow populations to grow and settlements to become permanent. By around 2000 BCE, we begin to see the emergence of what archaeologists recognize as distinctly Maya cultural traits. Small villages were appearing throughout the region, typically consisting of clusters of thatched roof houses built on low platforms to protect them from the seasonal floods. These early Maya were developing pottery techniques, creating simple but functional vessels for cooking and storage. The pottery from this period, while not as elaborate as what would come later, shows a growing sophistication in both form and decoration that hints at the artistic achievements to come. The early Preclassic period, spanning from roughly 2000 to 1000 BCE, marks the true beginning of Maya civilization as we understand it. During these centuries, we see the first evidence of social stratification, with some families accumulating more resources and status than others. This wasn't yet the complex hierarchy of later Maya society, but the seeds were being planted. Villages were growing larger, with some containing several hundred inhabitants, and we begin to see the construction of special buildings that serve communal or ritual purposes. One of the most significant developments of this period was the establishment of long-distance trade networks. The Maya lands, while rich in many resources, lacked certain materials that were highly valued, particularly obsidian for tool-making and jade for ornaments. To obtain these materials, the early Maya developed trading relationships that extended far beyond their immediate territories. Obsidian from the volcanic highlands of Guatemala was being traded to coastal communities, while shells and other marine products made their way inland. These trade networks weren't just about exchanging goods. They were conduits for ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that would help shape Maya civilization. The spiritual life of these early Maya was already complex and would form the foundation for the elaborate religious systems of later periods. Archaeological evidence suggests they were already practicing forms of ancestor veneration, burying their dead beneath the floors of their houses to keep them close to the living family. They were beginning to develop concepts of sacred space and time that would later evolve into the sophisticated Maya calendar systems and cosmology. Agriculture during the early Preclassic was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The Maya were learning to adapt their farming techniques to diverse environments, from the well-watered river valleys to the more challenging upland areas. They developed a variety of agricultural strategies, including slash-and-burn cultivation in forested areas, intensive gardening around settlements, and the beginnings of water management systems that would later become quite elaborate. The cultivation of cacao, which would become one of the most important trade goods and ritual substances in Maya culture, was already underway. Social organization was becoming more complex as well. While we don't have written records from this early period, the archaeological evidence suggests that villages were organizing themselves into larger political units, possibly chiefdoms led by hereditary leaders. These leaders were beginning to distinguish themselves through access to exotic goods, larger and more elaborate houses, and special burial treatments. The foundations of Maya kingship, though still centuries away from their full expression, were being laid. The early Preclassic also saw the beginnings of monumental architecture, though nothing on the scale of what would come later. At sites like Paso de la Armada on the Pacific coast of Chiapas, archaeologists have found evidence of large earthen mounds and platforms dating to around 1600 BCE. These structures, while modest compared to later pyramids, represent a significant investment of community labor and suggest a level of social organization capable of mobilizing workers for public projects. Ceramic production was becoming increasingly sophisticated during this period. Potters were experimenting with different clays, firing techniques, and decorative styles. The pottery sequence from this period shows a clear evolution from simple utilitarian vessels to more elaborate forms with complex decorations. Some vessels show evidence of having been used in ritual contexts, perhaps for offerings or ceremonial feasting, indicating that material culture was already being used to express social and religious meanings. The diet of early Preclassic Maya was diverse and nutritious. While maize, beans, and squash formed the agricultural base, they supplemented this with a wide variety of wild resources. Archaeological evidence from middens and coprolites reveals they consumed deer, dog, turkey, fish, turtles, and various shellfish. They gathered wild fruits, nuts, and roots, and they were already cultivating fruit trees around their settlements. The management of forest resources was becoming increasingly sophisticated, with certain trees being protected or encouraged because of their value for food, medicine, or construction materials. Language development during this period is difficult to trace directly, but linguistic reconstruction suggests that the major Maya language families were already diverging from their common ancestor. The geographical distribution of Maya languages in later periods indicates that significant population movements and interactions were occurring during the Preclassic, spreading different language groups across the Maya region. This linguistic diversity would become one of the defining characteristics of Maya civilization, with dozens of related but distinct languages being spoken across the Maya world. The early Preclassic Maya were also developing the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that would later become so sophisticated. While we don't have direct evidence of written numbers or calendar dates from this early period, the regular agricultural cycle and the need to predict seasonal changes would have encouraged careful observation of celestial phenomena. The Venus cycle, which would become so important in later Maya astronomy and mythology, was probably already being tracked, as were the movements of other planets and the patterns of the seasons. Artistic expression was flourishing even in these early centuries. Small clay figurines, often depicting women and possibly representing fertility or ancestor spirits, are common in early Preclassic sites. These figurines show considerable variation in style and execution, suggesting that different communities were developing their own artistic traditions. Stone sculpture was still rare, but carved jade and other greenstone objects begin to appear, showing skilled craftsmanship and an appreciation for these precious materials. The concept of sacred landscape was already developing among the early Preclassic Maya. Natural features like caves, mountains, and bodies of water were being incorporated into religious beliefs and practices. Caves, in particular, seem to have held special significance as portals to the underworld and places of ritual activity. Archaeological investigations of caves used during this period have revealed offerings of pottery, jade, and other valuable objects, as well as evidence of ceremonies involving fire and possibly bloodletting. Population growth during the early Preclassic was steady but not explosive. Villages remained relatively small, rarely exceeding a few hundred inhabitants, but the number of settlements was increasing, and people were colonizing new areas. The carrying capacity of the land was not yet being stressed, and there's little evidence of warfare or conflict between communities. This would change in later periods, but for now the Maya world was one of relatively peaceful expansion and development. The technologies available to the early Preclassic Maya were still relatively simple, but they were being refined and improved. Stone tools were made from chert, obsidian, and other materials, with techniques becoming increasingly sophisticated. Groundstone tools for processing food, particularly the metate and mano for grinding corn, were essential household items. Weaving and textile production, while leaving little archaeological trace, was certainly practiced, as evidenced by spindle whorls and the impressions of textiles on pottery. By the end of the early Preclassic period, around 1000 BCE, the stage was set for the dramatic developments that would follow. The basic elements of Maya civilization were in place. Agriculture, settled village life, craft specialization, long-distance trade, social hierarchy, and religious practices centered on ancestors and natural forces. What would come next would build on these foundations to create one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. As we move into the Middle Preclassic period, from roughly 1000 to 400 BCE, we witness an acceleration in the development of Maya civilization. This is when the Maya world begins to take on the characteristics we associate with complex societies: monumental architecture, elaborate religious ceremonies, sophisticated art styles, and increasingly hierarchical social structures. The scattered villages of earlier centuries were growing into towns, and some were beginning to show the first signs of becoming true urban centers. The site of Nakbe, located in the Mirador Basin of northern Guatemala, exemplifies this transformation. By 800 BCE, Nakbe had grown from a modest village into a significant center with substantial architecture. The builders of Nakbe were constructing platforms and pyramids that reached heights of 18 meters, not yet the towering structures of later periods, but impressive nonetheless. These buildings required organized labor forces, skilled architects and engineers, and a political system capable of mobilizing resources on a large scale. The very existence of such structures tells us that Maya society had crossed a crucial threshold from egalitarian villages to stratified communities with powerful leaders. The Middle Preclassic also saw the development of what would become one of the most distinctive features of Maya civilization, the ball game. Ball courts begin to appear at sites throughout the Maya region during this period. Simple at first, but growing more elaborate over time. The ball game was far more than entertainment or sport. It was a ritual activity with deep religious significance, often associated with themes of cosmic struggle, sacrifice, and renewal. The rubber ball itself, made from the latex of local trees, became a symbol of the sun moving through the underworld, and the game could serve as a form of divination or a substitute for warfare between competing polities. Agricultural intensification was crucial to supporting larger populations and more complex societies. The Middle Preclassic Maya were developing sophisticated water management systems, including reservoirs, canals, and raised fields in swampy areas. At sites like Cerros in Belize, archaeologists have found evidence of extensive canal systems that not only provided water for agriculture, but also served as transportation routes and possibly as symbolic features in the ritual landscape. These water management systems represent a significant investment of labor and engineering skill, and their construction and maintenance would have required coordinated community effort under centralized direction. The emergence of writing and complex notation systems marks another crucial development of this period. While the fully developed Maya script wouldn't appear until later, the Middle Preclassic saw the use of early symbolic systems that would eventually evolve into true writing. The earliest known Maya calendrical notation dates to around the 6th century BCE, showing that the Maya were already developing the complex timekeeping systems that would become one of their most remarkable achievements. These early inscriptions are rare and often difficult to interpret, but they represent the beginning of a literate tradition that would produce thousands of texts over the following centuries. Trade networks were expanding dramatically during the Middle Preclassic. The Maya were now part of a broader Mesoamerican interaction sphere that included the Olmec civilization to the west and various other cultural groups. Ideas, technologies, and luxury goods were flowing across vast distances. Jade from the Motagua Valley in Guatemala was being worked into elaborate ornaments and distributed throughout the Maya region and beyond. Obsidian from specific sources was being traded hundreds of kilometers from its origin, and archaeologists can trace these trade routes by analyzing the chemical signatures of obsidian artifacts. The influence of the Olmec civilization on the Middle Preclassic Maya was significant but complex. The Olmec, centered in the Gulf Coast region of Mexico, had developed Mesoamerica's first major civilization, with colossal stone heads, elaborate jade working, and possibly the earliest writing system in the Americas. Maya sites from this period show clear Olmec influence in their art styles, religious iconography, and possibly political organization. However, this wasn't simply a matter of the Maya copying the Olmec. Rather, they were selectively adopting and adapting Olmec ideas to fit their own cultural context. Religious practices were becoming increasingly elaborate and centralized. The construction of large pyramids and platforms created formal spaces for public rituals that could be witnessed by hundreds or thousands of people. These ceremonies likely included bloodletting by rulers and nobles, offerings of valuable goods, dancing, music, and possibly human sacrifice, though evidence for the latter is limited in this early period. The Maya were developing a complex mythology that explained the creation of the world, the origins of humans, and the relationships between gods, rulers, and common people. Social stratification was becoming more pronounced and institutionalized. Elite families were distinguishing themselves not just through wealth, but through claims to divine ancestry and special relationships with the gods. Elaborate burials from this period show that some individuals were interred with vast quantities of jade, pottery, and other valuable goods, while others received much simpler treatment. The bones themselves tell a story of inequality. Elite individuals tend to be taller and show fewer signs of nutritional stress than commoners, indicating differential access to food resources. The late Preclassic period, from 400 BCE to 250 CE, witnessed the full flowering of Maya civilization. This was when many of the greatest Maya cities were founded or experienced their first major period of growth. Sites like El Mirador, Tikal, Calakmul, and Copan were transformed from regional centers into major urban complexes with populations in the tens of thousands. The scale of construction during this period was staggering, with pyramids reaching heights of over 70 meters and entire complexes covering hundreds of hectares. El Mirador, perhaps the most impressive late Preclassic site, demonstrates the capabilities of Maya civilization at this time. The site's La Danta Pyramid Complex, with a total volume of 2,800,000 cubic meters, is one of the largest structures ever built in the ancient world. The amount of labor required to construct such monuments is almost incomprehensible, involving millions of person-days of work. The limestone had to be quarried, shaped, and transported. The fill material had to be gathered and carried. The plaster had to be produced in massive quantities. All of this required not just labor, but organization, planning, and the ability to feed and coordinate thousands of workers. The urban planning of late Preclassic cities shows sophisticated understanding of both practical and symbolic considerations. Cities were laid out according to cosmological principles, with buildings aligned to astronomical phenomena and arranged to create sacred landscapes. Causeways, known as sac biob, connected different parts of cities and linked urban centers to outlying communities. These raised roads, constructed of stone and covered with plaster, facilitated movement during the rainy season. and served as processional routes for religious ceremonies. The development of Maya writing reached a crucial stage during the late Preclassic. By the 1st century BCE, the Maya had developed a fully functional writing system capable of recording any aspect of their language. This script, which combined logographic and syllabic elements, was one of only a handful of independently invented writing systems in human history. The earliest lengthy texts date from this period, including historical narratives, mythological accounts, and astronomical observations. The ability to record information permanently transformed Maya society, allowing for the accumulation of knowledge across generations and the creation of official histories that legitimized royal power. Artistic achievement during the late Preclassic reached new heights of sophistication. Sculptors were creating elaborate stone monuments, including the first clearly dated stelae with portraits of rulers and hieroglyphic texts describing their deeds. Painters were decorating buildings with complex murals depicting mythological scenes and historical events. The famous murals from San Bartolo, dating to around 100 BCE, show the Maya creation myth in stunning detail, with gods, humans, and supernatural beings rendered in a sophisticated artistic style that would influence Maya art for centuries to come. The political landscape of the late Preclassic was complex and dynamic. Rather than a unified empire, the Maya region consisted of numerous independent polities, each centered on a major city and controlling surrounding territory. These polities competed with each other for resources, trade routes, and prestige, forming alliances and engaging in warfare. The rulers of these cities, who would later be known by the title Kuhul Ajau or Holy Lord, claimed divine mandate and portrayed themselves as intermediaries between the human and supernatural worlds. Warfare during the late Preclassic was becoming increasingly important and ritualized. While earlier conflicts may have been primarily about resources or territory, late Preclassic warfare also served religious and political functions. The capture of enemy nobles for sacrifice, the display of military prowess, and the acquisition of tribute all became important aspects of royal power. Fortifications begin to appear at some sites, including walls, moats, and defensive earthworks, indicating that the threat of attack was real and persistent. The economy of late Preclassic Maya society was complex and multifaceted. While agriculture remained the foundation, supporting both subsistence and surplus production, craft specialization had reached remarkable levels. Entire workshops were dedicated to producing specific goods: obsidian tools, jade ornaments, pottery vessels, textiles, and featherwork. These specialists were supported by agricultural surpluses and worked under the patronage of elite families or religious institutions. Markets, where both local products and long-distance trade goods were exchanged, were becoming important features of Maya cities. The religious system of the late Preclassic Maya had evolved into a complex theology with numerous deities, elaborate myths, and sophisticated concepts of time and cosmos. The Maya pantheon included gods of rain, maize, death, and war, among many others, each with specific attributes, responsibilities, and mythological associations. The calendar system, with its interlocking cycles of 13, 20, 260, and 365 days, provided a framework for organizing both ritual and practical activities. The long count calendar, which measured time from a mythological starting point in 3114 BCE, allowed the Maya to place themselves in a vast temporal framework, stretching from the distant past into the far future. Population density during the late Preclassic reached levels that wouldn't be equaled again in many areas until modern times. The Mirador Basin alone may have supported several 100,000 people at its peak. Feeding such populations required intensive agriculture, including terracing, raised fields, and possibly irrigation in some areas. The Maya were also managing forest resources carefully, maintaining gardens of useful trees and plants around their settlements, and protecting certain areas for hunting and gathering. The causes of the late Preclassic collapse, which saw the abandonment of many major sites around 200 to 250 CE, remain one of the great mysteries of Maya archaeology. El Mirador and other major centers were largely abandoned, their great pyramids left to be reclaimed by the forest. Various theories have been proposed, including environmental degradation, climate change, warfare, and social upheaval. Most likely, it was a combination of factors that led to this widespread collapse. However, it's important to note that this wasn't the end of Maya civilization, but rather a transformation. Many areas continued to be occupied, and new centers of power would emerge in the following Classic period. The early Classic period, spanning from approximately 250 to 600 CE, represents a remarkable renaissance in Maya civilization following the disruptions at the end of the Preclassic. This era witnessed the rise of new dynasties, the establishment of political systems that would endure for centuries, and achievements in art, architecture, and intellectual pursuits that would define the height of Maya culture. While some regions had experienced collapse and abandonment, others flourished, and entirely new centers of power emerged from what had been secondary sites. The city of Tikal, which would become one of the most powerful Maya polities, exemplifies this transformation. While Tikal had existed during the Preclassic period, it was during the early Classic that it truly rose to prominence. The dynasty that would rule Tikal for the next 6 centuries was founded by Yaks-eb-Zuk, whose name means first step shark, around the 1st century CE, though it was during the early Classic that his successors consolidated power and began the ambitious building programs that would make Tikal one of the wonders of the ancient world. The political landscape of the early Classic was characterized by the emergence of what scholars call the theatre-state model of governance. Maya rulers were not just political leaders, but cosmic actors who performed elaborate rituals that maintained the order of the universe. These performances, conducted atop pyramids in full view of assembled crowds, included bloodletting ceremonies where rulers would pierce their tongues, earlobes, or genitals with stingray spines or obsidian blades, offering their blood to the gods. Such rituals were believed to open portals to the supernatural world, allowing rulers to communicate with ancestors and deities. One of the most significant developments of the early Classic was the increasing influence of Teotihuacan, the massive city in central Mexico that was, at this time, one of the largest urban centers in the world. The nature of Teotihuacan's relationship with the Maya remains debated, but its impact was undeniable. In 378 CE, according to texts from multiple Maya sites, a figure named Siajkak, described as a military leader from the west, arrived in the Maya lowlands. On the same day, January 16th by our calendar, the ruler of Tikal died, and shortly thereafter, a new ruler with clear Teotihuacan connections took power. This event, sometimes called the Entrada or Entry, marked a turning point in Maya history. The new ruler of Tikal, Yaks-nu-Nahin, was the son of a figure called Spear-Thrower Owl, who may have been a ruler of Teotihuacan itself. Under this new dynasty, Tikal adopted numerous Teotihuacan-style elements in its art and architecture, including the talud tablero architectural style and warrior imagery featuring figures in Teotihuacan military costume. However, this wasn't simply foreign domination. Rather, the Maya elite strategically incorporated Teotihuacan prestige and symbolism to enhance their own power. The impact of Teotihuacan influence extended far beyond Tikal. Cities throughout the Maya lowlands show evidence of contact with Teotihuacan, whether through trade, diplomacy, or military intervention. Copan, far to the southeast in present-day Honduras, was founded or refounded in 426 CE by Kinich Yaks-Kuk-Mo, a ruler who also claimed connections to Teotihuacan. The widespread adoption of certain Teotihuacan symbols and styles suggests that association with this great metropolis conveyed significant prestige and political advantage. Architecture during the early Classic period evolved in remarkable ways. The Maya developed the corbel arch, also known as the false arch, which allowed them to create interior spaces in stone buildings without the true arch known in the Old World. This technique, where stones are layered progressively inward until they meet at the top, became a defining characteristic of Maya architecture. Pyramids grew taller and more elaborate, often built over earlier structures in a practice that created nested layers of construction spanning centuries. The Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque, though completed in the late Classic, had its foundations in architectural traditions established during the early Classic. These buildings weren't just monuments to royal power, but were conceived as sacred mountains, recreations of the primordial landscape where the gods had performed the acts of creation. The pyramid's steep stairs, difficult and dangerous to climb, reinforced the separation between the sacred space at the summit and the profane world below. Writing and literacy expanded significantly during the early Classic. While earlier texts had been relatively short and formulaic, early Classic inscriptions became increasingly elaborate and narrative. Scribes, who held high status in Maya society, developed sophisticated calligraphy and expanded the corpus of hieroglyphic signs. They recorded not just dates and names, but complex historical narratives, astronomical observations, and mythological accounts. The production of books made from bark paper and folded accordion style likely increased during this period, though few have survived the tropical climate and later Spanish destruction. The early Classic saw crucial developments in Maya mathematics and astronomy. The concept of zero, represented by a shell-shaped glyph, was fully integrated into the mathematical system, allowing for complex calculations and the precise recording of astronomical phenomena. Maya astronomers were tracking not just the movements of the Sun and Moon, but also the cycles of Venus, Mars, and other planets. They could predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy, and had calculated the length of the tropical year to within a few minutes of its actual value. These astronomical observations weren't purely scientific, but were intimately connected to religious and political concerns. The movements of celestial bodies were believed to influence human affairs, and rulers timed important events like coronations, marriages, and military campaigns according to astronomical cycles. The Venus cycle, in particular, was associated with warfare, and attacks were often launched when Venus first appeared as the morning star, a time considered particularly auspicious for military ventures. Artistic innovation flourished during the early Classic period. Ceramic vessels became increasingly elaborate, with polychrome painting depicting scenes from mythology and court life. The famous Codex-style pottery, with its fine black line drawing on cream-coloured background, achieved a level of artistic sophistication comparable to the finest manuscript illumination traditions anywhere in the world. These vessels often served as diplomatic gifts, funeral offerings, or ritual containers, and their iconography provides invaluable insights into Maya beliefs and practices. Stone sculpture also reached new heights of achievement. Stelae, tall stone monuments carved with images of rulers and hieroglyphic texts, became standard features of Maya cities. These monuments served multiple functions. They commemorated important events, legitimized royal authority, and marked sacred spaces within cities. The portraits on these stelae show increasing naturalism and attention to individual features, though they remained highly idealized representations emphasizing the ruler's divine attributes rather than physical accuracy. The economy of the early Classic period was increasingly sophisticated and interconnected. Long-distance trade routes, some extending over 1,000 kilometers, connected the Maya region with central Mexico, the Pacific coast, and the Caribbean. Professional merchants, possibly organized into guilds, transported valuable goods like jade, obsidian, cacao, salt, and exotic feathers. Cacao beans served as a form of currency, with standardized values allowing for complex economic transactions. Agricultural production intensified to support growing populations and increasingly elaborate elite activities. The Maya developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining soil fertility in the challenging tropical environment. They created raised fields in wetland areas, terraced hillsides to prevent erosion, and developed complex agroforestry systems that combined annual crops with useful trees. The management of water resources became increasingly important, with the construction of reservoirs, dams, and canal systems that could store water during the dry season and control flooding during the rains. Social organization during the early Classic became increasingly complex and hierarchical. At the apex stood the Kuhul Ajal, the divine ruler who claimed descent from the gods and served as the primary intermediary between the human and supernatural worlds. Below the ruler was an elaborate hierarchy of nobles, including members of the royal family, provincial governors, military leaders, and high-ranking priests. These elites controlled land, labor, and trade, and they displayed their status through elaborate costumes, jewelry, and exclusive access to certain goods and spaces. The middle ranks of society included skilled artisans, scribes, lower-ranking priests, and successful merchants. These individuals, while not noble, enjoyed certain privileges and could accumulate wealth and status through their specialized skills. The majority of the population consisted of farmers and laborers who produced the agricultural surpluses and provided the labor for construction projects that supported the entire system. While these commoners had limited political power, they weren't simply passive subjects but participated in religious ceremonies, markets, and community organizations. Warfare during the early Classic took on increasingly ritualized forms while remaining brutally real in its consequences. The capture of enemy nobles for sacrifice became a primary goal of military campaigns, with successful war leaders gaining tremendous prestige. The Maya developed sophisticated military technologies, including atlatls, spear throwers, that could propel darts with deadly force, and defensive armor made from cotton and wood. Fortifications became more elaborate, with some cities constructing extensive defensive walls and earthworks. The religious system of the early Classic Maya had evolved into an elaborate theology, with hundreds of deities and complex mythological narratives. The Maya cosmos was conceived as having multiple levels, 13 levels of heaven, the earthly plane, and 9 levels of the underworld. Each level was associated with specific deities and supernatural beings. The ceiba tree, with its massive trunk and spreading canopy, was seen as the world tree that connected these different levels, with its roots in the underworld and its branches in the heavens. Ritual practices became increasingly elaborate and standardized across the Maya region. The dedication of new buildings required specific ceremonies, often involving the burial of offerings beneath the structure. These dedicatory caches might include jade objects, pottery vessels, obsidian blades, and sometimes sacrificial victims. The termination of buildings, when old structures were destroyed to make way for new construction, also required specific rituals to properly release the spiritual forces contained within the building. The ball game continued to be one of the most important ritual activities, with ball courts becoming larger and more elaborate. The game served multiple functions. It was entertainment, religious ceremony, and sometimes a form of conflict resolution between competing groups. The rubber ball, representing the sun moving through the underworld, was kept in motion by players using their hips, forearms, and shoulders, never their hands or feet. The game could have deadly consequences, with losing players or captives sometimes sacrificed, their deaths reenacting mythological events. By the end of the early Classic period, around 600 CE, Maya civilization had reached a level of complexity and sophistication comparable to any contemporary civilization in the world. Cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Palenque had grown into major urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands. The political, religious, and economic systems that would characterize the late Classic period were firmly established. The stage was set for what many consider the golden age of Maya civilization. The late Classic period, stretching from 600 to 900 CE, represents the absolute zenith of Maya civilization, a time when art, architecture, astronomy, and writing reached their fullest expression. During these 3 centuries, the Maya lowlands were home to dozens of powerful city-states, each ruled by dynasties that traced their legitimacy back through generations of divine kings. The political landscape was one of constantly shifting alliances and rivalries, with cities rising and falling in power through warfare, diplomacy, and dynastic marriages. At the heart of this political world stood 2 superpowers, Tikal and Calakmul. These cities, located roughly 100 kilometers apart in the central lowlands, became the centers of competing alliance networks that dominated Maya politics for much of the late Classic period. Their rivalry, which scholars have compared to the Cold War of the 20th century, shaped the destiny of dozens of smaller cities and influenced events throughout the Maya world. Tikal, with its soaring pyramids that still rise above the rainforest canopy, entered the late Classic period as one of the most established powers in the Maya world. The city's great plaza, surrounded by pyramids, palaces and stelae, could accommodate thousands of people for public ceremonies. Temple 4, completed around 741 CE under the ruler Yikin Chankawil, rises to a height of 65 meters, making it one of the tallest structures in the pre-Columbian Americas. From its summit on clear days, one can see across the forest to other pyramids at sites dozens of kilometers away, a visible demonstration of Tikal's power and reach. The dynasty that ruled Tikal during the late Classic claimed an ancient pedigree, tracing their lineage back to the founder Yax-Ebsuk in the 1st century CE. This deep history was crucial to their legitimacy, and Tikal's rulers constantly referenced their ancestors in monuments and rituals. The tomb of Jasar Chankawil, who ruled from 682 to 734 CE and led Tikal's resurgence after a period of decline, was placed beneath Temple 1 in the Great Plaza. His burial, accompanied by jade ornaments, pottery vessels and carved bones with hieroglyphic texts, transformed the pyramid into a permanent monument to his reign and a focal point for ancestor veneration. Calakmul, Tikal's great rival, was equally impressive in scale and ambition. The city's core covers more than 20 square kilometers, with thousands of structures ranging from massive pyramids to modest residential compounds. Structure 2 at Calakmul, modified repeatedly over centuries, became one of the largest pyramid structures in the Maya world, its mass rivaling anything at Tikal. The city controlled a vast territory in the central lowlands and established alliances with cities throughout the region to counter Tikal's influence. The rivalry between these superpowers played out not through direct confrontation alone, but through proxy conflicts and competition for allies. Cities like Dos Pilas, founded by a renegade prince from Tikal who allied with Calakmul, became pawns in this larger game. Naranjo, Caracol, and other significant centres shifted allegiances between the two powers, depending on military fortunes and dynastic politics. The inscriptions from this period read like diplomatic dispatches, recording visits between rulers, royal marriages that cemented alliances, and military campaigns that shifted the balance of power. Palenque, located in the western lowlands of modern Chiapas, Mexico, represents a different model of late Classic achievement. While smaller than Tikal or Calakmul, Palenque produced some of the most exquisite art and architecture in the Maya world. The city reached its apex under Kinich Jana Pakal, who ruled for 68 years from 615 to 683 CE, one of the longest reigns in Maya history. Pakal's tomb, discovered in 1952 within the Temple of the Inscriptions, remains one of the most spectacular archaeological finds in the Americas. The sarcophagus lid covering Pakal's tomb depicts the ruler at the moment of his death and rebirth, falling into the underworld while the world tree rises above him. The imagery is so complex and detailed that it has inspired countless interpretations, from the plausible to the fantastical. The tomb itself was a marvel of engineering, with a psychoduct, a stone tube running from the burial chamber to the temple above that allowed Pakal's spirit to communicate with the living. His body was adorned with hundreds of jade beads, and his face was covered with a mosaic mask of jade pieces, creating a portrait of eternal youth. Pakal's son, Kinich Khan Balam, continued his father's building program and intellectual pursuits. The group of the Cross at Palenque, consisting of 3 temples arranged around a plaza, contains some of the longest and most informative hieroglyphic texts from the Maya world. These inscriptions detail Palenque's mythological history, tracing the city's origins back to divine ancestors who lived thousands of years in the past. The texts also describe complex astronomical calculations and religious concepts that provide invaluable insights into Maya thought. Copan, located in the southeastern periphery of the Maya world in present-day Honduras, developed its own distinctive character during the late Classic. The city's location in a fertile valley along the Copan River provided excellent agricultural land, while nearby sources of volcanic tuff, a soft, workable stone, allowed for the creation of incredibly detailed sculptures. The hieroglyphic stairway at Copan, completed around 755 CE, contains the longest Maya hieroglyphic inscription known, with over 2,000 glyphs recording the history of Copan's dynasty. Under rulers like Waxaklajunubarkawil, also known as 18 Rabbit, who ruled from 695 to 738 CE, Copan became a centre of artistic and intellectual achievement. The stelae erected during his reign show a three-dimensional sculptural style unique in the Maya world, with figures carved almost fully in the round. The city's scribes and astronomers made significant advances in understanding celestial cycles, and Copan may have hosted conferences where scholars from different cities gathered to compare observations and adjust the calendar. The tragic end of 18 Rabbit's reign illustrates the volatility of late classic politics. In 738 CE, he was captured by Kek Tiliuchan-Yopat, the ruler of Quirigua, a former vassal city. 18 Rabbit was sacrificed, a shocking event that reverberated throughout the Maya world. Quirigua, freed from Copan's control, experienced its own flourishing, creating some of the tallest stelae ever erected by the Maya, including Stela E, which stands over 10 meters high and weighs 65 tons. Yaxchilan, dramatically situated on a horseshoe bend of the Usumacinta River, became prominent during the late Classic under a series of powerful rulers. The city's location provided natural defences and control over river trade, while the surrounding forests supplied valuable resources. Bird Jaguar IV, who ruled from 752 to 768 CE, commissioned numerous monuments depicting his military victories and ritual performances. The lintels of Yaxchilan, carved from hard sapodilla wood, show scenes of bloodletting rituals and vision quests, with a level of detail that provides intimate glimpses into royal ceremony. The nearby city of Piedras Negra, also on the Usumacinta, developed a rivalry with Yaxchilan that lasted for centuries. The two cities competed for control of the river valley and surrounding territories, with wars, captures, and shifting alliances marking their relationship. Piedras Negras is particularly important for Maya studies, because it was here that Tatiana Proskuryakov first demonstrated that Maya inscriptions recorded historical events rather than just astronomical observations, revolutionizing our understanding of Maya writing. Karakul, located in present-day Belize, exemplifies the complex political dynamics of the late Classic period. The city experienced dramatic swings in fortune, at times dominating vast territories and defeating even Tikal in battle, at other times falling under the control of more powerful neighbours. Karakul's urban design was unique, with an extensive system of causeways radiating out from the centre to integrate outlying residential groups into the urban fabric. The city's agricultural systems, including extensive terracing, allowed it to support a population that may have exceeded 100,000 people at its peak. Bonampak, though never a major political power, has provided us with one of our most vivid windows into late Classic Maya life through its famous murals. Painted around 790 CE, the murals in Structure 1 depict scenes of court life, warfare and sacrifice in brilliant colour and minute detail. The paintings show us details that rarely survive in other media. The elaborate costumes of nobles, the musical instruments used in ceremonies, the violence of battle, and the agony of sacrificial victims. These murals remind us that behind the mathematical achievements and architectural monuments, Maya civilization was built on very human ambitions, conflicts, and suffering. The site of Dos Pilas tells a particularly dramatic story of late Classic politics. Founded in the early 7th century by Balaj Chan Kawil, a prince from Tikal who allied himself with Calakmul, Dos Pilas became a major regional power. The city's history, recorded in numerous hieroglyphic texts, reads like a political thriller, with betrayals, dramatic battles, and shifting alliances. The city's sudden collapse around 760 CE, when its monuments were torn down to build defensive walls against attacking enemies, provides a stark reminder of how quickly fortune could change in the Maya world. Each major city developed its own distinctive architectural style during the late Classic. The architects of Palenque perfected the use of the mansard roof, creating elegant buildings with interior galleries and multiple stories. Copan's builders exploited the local volcanic tuff to create incredibly detailed facade sculptures. Tikal's architects favoured tall, steep pyramids with small temples at their summits, emphasising vertical height. These regional styles, while sharing common Maya elements, gave each city its own visual identity. The Late Classic also saw the full development of the Maya palace complex as both residential space and administrative centre. These palaces, often called royal courts by archaeologists, consisted of multiple buildings arranged around courtyards, with throne rooms, residential quarters, kitchens, storage facilities and workshops. The central acropolis at Tikal, modified continuously over centuries, eventually contained over 40 buildings connected by a maze of courtyards and corridors. These palaces were not just royal residences but the nerve centres of Maya states, where tribute was collected, justice was administered and diplomatic negotiations were conducted. The cultural achievements of the Late Classic Maya extended far beyond monumental architecture and political manoeuvring. This was a civilization that had developed sophisticated systems of knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, medicine and agriculture. The arts flourished as never before, with painters, sculptors and craftspeople creating works of stunning beauty and technical mastery. The intellectual life of the Late Classic Maya rivals that of any contemporary civilization, with scribes and scholars pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and expression. The Maya writing system reached its fullest development during the Late Classic period. With over 800 known glyphs, the script could express any nuance of spoken language, from historical narratives to poetry. Scribes, who often signed their works, held high social status and were frequently members of the royal family or high nobility. The title Ajitzib, meaning he of the writing, appears in many inscriptions, indicating the importance of literacy in elite culture. Scribal workshops produced not only stone monuments and painted ceramics, but also books made from bark paper, though tragically few of these have survived. The complexity of Maya writing goes beyond simple literacy. The script employed multiple levels of meaning, with glyphs that could be read phonetically, logographically, or as rebuses. Scribes delighted in wordplay, creating texts that could be read in different ways or that contained hidden meanings accessible only to the educated elite. Some texts employ what scholars call pseudo-writing, arrangements of glyphs that look like text but don't actually spell out words, serving instead as magical or decorative elements. Mathematics and astronomy were intimately connected in Maya thought, and late classic scholars made remarkable advances in both fields. The Maya number system, using only 3 symbols, a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and a shell for 0, could express numbers in the millions and perform complex calculations. This positional notation system, similar in principle to our decimal system but using base 20, was more sophisticated than the Roman numerals used in contemporary Europe. Maya astronomers tracked celestial bodies with extraordinary precision. They calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes for the planet to return to the same position relative to the Sun, as 584 days, compared to the modern value of 583.92 days. They tracked lunar cycles so accurately that they could predict eclipses centuries in advance. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Maya books, contains eclipse tables that accurately predict eclipses for 33 years without error. The Maya calendar system, fully elaborated by the Late Classic, was one of the most complex timekeeping systems ever developed. It consisted of multiple interlocking cycles, the 260-day ritual calendar called the Tzolkin, the 365-day solar calendar called the Hab, the long count that tracked days from a mythological starting point, and various other cycles tracking the movements of planets and other celestial phenomena. The correlation between these different cycles created a rich temporal framework that influenced every aspect of Maya life. Medicine and healing practices in late classic Maya society combined empirical knowledge with religious belief. Maya healers, called Aj Kenob, understood the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants and could perform sophisticated surgical procedures. Archaeological evidence shows that they practiced dental modification, filling teeth with jade inlays and shaping them into different forms. They could set broken bones, treat wounds, and possibly perform trepanation, the removal of skull portions to treat head injuries or relieve pressure. The Maya pharmacopoeia included treatments for a wide range of ailments. They used willow bark, containing the precursor to aspirin, for pain relief. Tobacco was used not just ceremonially but medicinally, as were various hallucinogenic plants in ritual healing contexts. The boundaries between physical and spiritual healing were fluid, with illness often attributed to supernatural causes requiring both medical and ritual treatment. Agricultural innovations during the Late Classic allowed the Maya to support dense populations in a challenging tropical environment. They developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining soil fertility, including the use of cover crops, composting, and crop rotation. The discovery of ancient raised fields in wetland areas shows that the Maya were practicing intensive agriculture that could produce multiple harvests per year. These raised fields, called chinampas, were similar to those used in central Mexico and could be extraordinarily productive. Forest management was another area of Maya expertise. Rather than simply clearing forest for agriculture, the Maya practiced selective cultivation, maintaining forest gardens that combined useful trees with annual crops. They encouraged the growth of ramon trees, whose nuts provided a protein-rich food source, and maintained groves of cacao, avocado, and other fruit trees. This agroforestry system provided diverse food sources while maintaining ecological balance. The arts flourished during the Late Classic as never before. Ceramic painting reached extraordinary heights of sophistication, with artists creating narrative scenes that wrapped around cylindrical vessels. These paintings, executed with fine brushes made from human hair, depicted mythological events, palace scenes, and ritual activities with remarkable detail. The artists often included hieroglyphic captions identifying figures and explaining actions, creating visual narratives that complemented written texts. Jade working, one of the most prestigious crafts, required extraordinary skill and patience. Jade, harder than steel, had to be worked with string saws and abrasives in a process that could take months for a single piece. Maya lapidaries created elaborate ear flares, necklaces, masks, and plaques that were among the most valued objects in Maya society. The association of jade with water, maize, and life itself made these objects not just beautiful ornaments, but powerful religious symbols. Featherwork, though rarely preserved in the archaeological record, was another highly developed art form. The iridescent feathers of the quetzal, the blue-green of the cotinga, and the brilliant red of the scarlet macaw were worked into elaborate headdresses, capes, and standards. These feather objects were so valuable that they served as tribute payments and diplomatic gifts. The acquisition of feathers from tropical birds required extensive trade networks and possibly managed breeding programs. Music and dance were integral to Maya cultural life, though these ephemeral arts leave little direct archaeological evidence. Ceramic figurines and painted scenes show us musicians playing drums, flutes, trumpets, and rattles. Dancers are depicted in elaborate costumes, often impersonating gods or supernatural beings. The acoustics of Maya plazas and courtyards were carefully designed to amplify sound, allowing performances to be heard by large audiences. The Late Classic Maya diet was remarkably diverse and sophisticated. While maize remained the staple, providing perhaps 60% of calories, the Maya consumed a wide variety of foods. Beans, squash, chili peppers, and tomatoes were cultivated, while hunting provided deer, peccary, tapir, and birds. Rivers and coasts supplied fish, turtles, and shellfish. The Maya raised turkeys and dogs for meat, and possibly managed deer populations in semi-wild conditions. Chocolate held special significance in Maya culture, serving as both an elite beverage and a form of currency. The preparation of chocolate was a complex process involving fermentation, drying, roasting, and grinding of cacao beans, which were then mixed with water, chili peppers, and other flavorings. The resulting beverage was frothed by pouring it between vessels, creating a foam that was particularly prized. Ceramic vessels specifically designed for chocolate preparation and consumption are common in elite burials. Social life in late classic cities was complex and stratified, but not rigidly segregated. While elites lived in palace complexes and stone buildings near city centres, commoners inhabited neighbourhoods that radiated out from the urban core. These residential groups, consisting of multiple structures arranged around patios, housed extended families who often specialized in particular crafts or occupations. The discovery of luxury goods in some commoner households suggests that successful artisans and merchants could accumulate wealth and status. Markets were important features of late classic cities, though their archaeological traces are subtle. Ethnohistoric sources and the distribution of trade goods suggest that regular markets were held in plaza areas, where both local products and long-distance trade items were exchanged. The standardization of ceramic vessels and other goods indicates mass production for market exchange. Professional merchants, called polum, travelled established trade routes, some extending over 1,000 kilometres. The role of women in late classic society was complex and varied. While political power was primarily held by men, women of royal blood played crucial roles as dynastic links and ritual practitioners. Several women ruled Maya cities in their own right, including Lady Six Sky of Naranjo, who governed for several decades in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. Women are depicted in art performing bloodletting rituals, participating in ceremonies, and engaging in textile production, one of the most important economic activities. Childhood and education in Maya society began early, with children learning gender-appropriate skills from their parents and community members. Elite children, both boys and girls, might receive formal education in writing, mathematics, and religious knowledge. The passage from childhood to adulthood was marked by elaborate ceremonies with different rituals for different social classes. Young nobles underwent painful bloodletting ceremonies that mark their entry into adult religious and political life. The terminal classic period, roughly from 800 to 1000 CE, witnessed one of the most dramatic transformations in human history, the collapse of classic Maya civilization in the southern lowlands. Within a span of roughly 150 years, cities that had thrived for centuries were abandoned, their pyramids and palaces left to be reclaimed by the forest. This collapse wasn't sudden or simultaneous across the region, but rather a rolling catastrophe that affected different areas at different times, with some regions experiencing rapid depopulation, while others underwent more gradual decline. The last dated monuments at various sites tell a story of cascading failure. Copan erected its last dated stela in 822 CE. Palenque's last inscription dates to 799 CE. Tikal's last monument was dedicated in 869 CE. Tanina, one of the last holdouts, carved its final date in 909 CE. After these dates, the tradition of erecting carved monuments with long count dates, which had been central to Maya political culture for over 1,000 years, ceased entirely in the southern lowlands. Understanding this collapse requires examining multiple interconnected factors that created a perfect storm of crisis. Environmental degradation played a significant role. Centuries of intensive agriculture had depleted soils in many areas, while deforestation for construction and fuel had altered local climate patterns. Lake sediment cores from across the Maya region show evidence of severe erosion during the terminal classic, indicating widespread environmental distress. The Maya had pushed their environment to its limits, and the ecological foundation of their civilization was crumbling. Climate change compounded these environmental problems. Paleoclimatic data from cave formations, lake sediments, and ocean cores indicate that the terminal classic coincided with one of the most severe droughts of the past 2 millennia. This drought wasn't constant but came in waves, with particularly severe dry periods around 810, 860, and 910 CE. For a civilization dependent on rainfall agriculture and seasonal water storage, these droughts would have been catastrophic. The political system of competing city-states, which had driven much of the cultural achievement of the Classic period, became increasingly unstable during the Terminal Classic. Warfare intensified and became more destructive. Rather than the ritualized conflicts focused on capturing noble prisoners, Terminal Classic warfare increasingly aimed at territorial conquest and the destruction of enemies. Defensive fortifications became more common, and some sites show evidence of violent destruction. The site of Dos Pilas provides a vivid example of this breakdown. Around 760 CE, the city was attacked and its monuments defaced. The survivors hastily constructed defensive palisades, tearing down temple facades to build walls. The site was abandoned soon after, its population dispersing to fortified hilltop settlements. This pattern of urban abandonment and population dispersal was repeated across the southern lowlands. Population pressure had reached critical levels by the terminal classic. The southern lowlands may have supported as many as 10 million people at the peak of the classic period, a population density that wouldn't be reached again until modern times. This dense population required intensive agriculture and careful resource management, systems that were vulnerable to disruption. When drought struck and agricultural yields declined, there simply wasn't enough food to support such large populations. Social inequality, always present in Maya society, seems to have become more extreme during the terminal classic. The gap between elites and commoners widened, with rulers demanding ever greater tribute and labour for increasingly grandiose projects. At Copan, skeletal analysis shows that while elites maintain their health and stature during the terminal classic, commoners show increasing signs of malnutrition and disease. This growing inequality may have undermined the social contract that legitimized elite rule. The ideological foundation of Maya kingship was also under strain. Kings derived their legitimacy from their ability to intercede with the gods, ensuring rainfall, agricultural fertility, and military success. When droughts persisted despite royal rituals, when crops failed despite sacrifices, and when enemies triumphed despite ceremonies, the divine mandate of kings was called into question. The cessation of monument erection may reflect not just economic decline, but a crisis of faith in the institution of divine kingship itself. Disease may have played a role in the collapse, though direct evidence is limited. The dense populations of classic Maya cities would have been vulnerable to epidemic diseases, particularly when weakened by malnutrition. Some scholars have suggested that the arrival of new diseases from increased contact with central Mexico might have contributed to population decline, though this remains speculative. Not all regions experience collapse in the same way. While the southern lowlands were largely abandoned, the northern lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula experienced a florescence during the terminal classic. Cities like Uxmal, Caba, and Labna reached their peak during this period, developing a distinctive architectural style known as Puke. These northern cities may have benefited from the collapse of the south, receiving refugees and controlling trade routes that had previously passed through the southern lowlands. Chichen Itza, which would become one of the most powerful Maya cities of the post-classic period, rose to prominence during the terminal classic. The city shows strong influences from central Mexico, particularly from the Toltec culture, though the nature of this relationship remains debated. Chichen Itza's art and architecture blend Maya and central Mexican elements in unique ways, creating a cosmopolitan style that would influence the entire region. The Puc region cities developed innovative architectural techniques during the terminal classic. They perfected the use of concrete cores faced with thin stone veneers, allowing for the construction of elaborate facades with intricate geometric designs. The Cod's Poop at Caba, with its facade covered in hundreds of masks of the rain god Chac, exemplifies this architectural exuberance. These buildings suggest that despite the crisis in the south, some Maya communities were still capable of mobilizing significant resources for construction projects. Water management became increasingly critical during the terminal classic droughts. Cities that survived longest were often those with the most sophisticated water storage systems. Tikal's system of reservoirs and channels could store millions of litres of water, allowing the city to survive shorter droughts. However, when multi-year droughts struck, even these systems proved inadequate. The northern cities, with access to cenotes, natural sinkholes providing access to groundwater, had a significant advantage over the southern cities dependent on surface water. Trade networks were disrupted during the terminal classic, contributing to economic decline. The long-distance trade in obsidian, jade, and other valuable materials that had connected Maya cities for centuries began to break down. Maritime trade routes along the coast may have become more important as overland routes through the collapsing southern lowlands became dangerous or impassable. This shift in trade routes would have further marginalized the inland cities of the southern lowlands. The collapse wasn't just demographic but cultural. The traditions of hieroglyphic writing, monumental architecture and elaborate ceramic production that had defined classic Maya civilization largely disappeared from the southern lowlands. When Spanish explorers arrived in the 16th century, they found the great cities of the classic period overgrown and abandoned, their original names forgotten. The local Maya population had no memory of who had built these monuments or why they had been abandoned. Yet it's crucial to understand that this wasn't the end of the Maya people or even Maya civilization. Millions of Maya continue to live in the region, maintaining their languages, agricultural practices, and many cultural traditions. The collapse was primarily an elite phenomenon, affecting the ruling classes and the institutions they controlled. Commoner populations, while certainly impacted by the crisis, showed remarkable resilience, adapting to new conditions and maintaining core elements of Maya culture. Archaeological evidence from the Terminal Classic shows diverse responses to crisis. Some communities abandoned traditional practices entirely, while others attempted to maintain classic traditions on a reduced scale. Small groups continued to visit abandoned ceremonial centers, leaving offerings at old shrines. Squatters occupied palace buildings, subdividing grand throne rooms into modest living spaces. These varied responses remind us that collapse is not a single event, but a complex process of transformation. The environmental recovery following the collapse was relatively rapid. Forest regeneration began almost immediately in abandoned areas, and within a few centuries the jungle had reclaimed most classic period sites. This reforestation may have helped restore local rainfall patterns and soil fertility, creating conditions that would allow for population recovery in later periods. The resilience of the tropical forest ecosystem stands in contrast to the fragility of the human systems that had temporarily dominated it. The early post-classic period, spanning from approximately 1000 to 1200 CE, represents not an ending but a transformation of Maya civilization. While the great cities of the southern lowlands lay abandoned, new centers of power emerged, trade networks were restructured, and Maya culture adapted to changed circumstances. This was a period of remarkable resilience, innovation, and cultural synthesis as the Maya incorporated influences from across Mesoamerica while maintaining their distinctive identity. The northern Yucatan Peninsula became the new heartland of Maya civilization during the early Postclassic. The flat limestone shelf of the northern lowlands, while lacking the surface rivers of the south, had extensive underground water systems accessible through cenotes. These natural wells not only provided reliable water sources, but also held deep religious significance as portals to the underworld. Cities that controlled important cenotes held significant advantages in this water-scarce landscape. Chichen Itza emerged as the dominant power of the early Postclassic, controlling much of the northern Yucatan Peninsula and influencing regions far beyond. The city's architecture reflects a cosmopolitan blend of Maya and Central Mexican elements, creating monuments unlike anything from the classic period. The famous Castillo Pyramid, with its 4 stairways of 91 steps each, plus the platform totaling 365, the number of days in the solar year, demonstrates the continued importance of astronomical knowledge in Maya architecture. The Great Bull Court at Chichen Itza, the largest in Mesoamerica at 168 meters long and 70 meters wide, represents the bull game tradition on an unprecedented scale. The acoustics of this court are remarkable. A whisper at one end can be heard clearly at the other, and a clap produces multiple echoes that some researchers suggest mimic the call of the Quetzal bird. The reliefs on the walls depict the sacrifice of bull players, with blood spurting from a decapitated player's neck, transforming into serpents and vegetation, linking sacrifice to agricultural fertility. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza provides extraordinary evidence for post-classic ritual practices. This natural well, 60 meters in diameter and 20 meters deep, was a pilgrimage destination where offerings were made to the rain god Chake. Dredging operations have recovered thousands of objects from the cenote, including gold discs, jade ornaments, copal incense, textiles, and human remains. The variety of objects, some originating from as far away as Colombia, demonstrates the extensive trade networks of the post-classic period. The political organization of Chichen Itza appears to have differed from classic period cities. Rather than rule by a single kuhulajau, evidence suggests the city may have been governed by a council of nobles, a system called multipal. This more collective form of governance may have been an adaptation to the political instability of the terminal classic, distributing power among multiple lineages rather than concentrating it in a single dynasty. However, the exact nature of Chichen Itza's government remains debated among scholars. The relationship between Chichen Itza and the Toltec civilization of central Mexico has been one of the most contentious issues in Maya archaeology. The similarities between Chichen Itza and Tula, the Toltec capital, are undeniable. Both cities feature serpent columns, warrior figures, skull racks, and similar artistic motifs. Traditional interpretations suggested a Toltec invasion or migration to Chichen Itza, but more recent scholarship emphasizes interaction and exchange rather than conquest, with influences flowing in both directions. Maritime trade became increasingly important during the early Postclassic. With overland routes through the southern lowlands disrupted, coastal trade routes around the Yucatan Peninsula gained prominence. Ports like Isla Cerritos on the north coast and Wild Cane Cay in Belize became important transshipment points. Large trading canoes, some reportedly carrying 40 people, transported goods including salt, honey, cotton textiles, cacao, obsidian, and jade along these coastal routes. The economy of the early Postclassic was increasingly commercialized. While classic period exchange had been dominated by gift-giving among elites and tribute collection, the Postclassic saw the expansion of market exchange. Standardized currency systems developed, with cacao beans serving as small change and copper axes, jade beads, and other items functioning as higher denominations. This monetization of the economy allowed for more complex commercial transactions and may have enabled greater economic mobility for non-elite merchants. Salt production became a major industry in the northern lowlands during the early Postclassic. The north coast of Yucatan has extensive salt flats where seawater could be evaporated to produce salt, the essential commodity for preserving food and for human health in the hot tropical climate. Control over salt production provided significant economic power, and the salt trade connected the northern lowlands with regions throughout Mesoamerica. Religious practices evolved during the early Postclassic, incorporating new deities and rituals while maintaining core Maya beliefs. The feathered serpent deity, known as Kukulkan to the Maya and Quetzalcoatl in central Mexico, became increasingly prominent. This deity, associated with wind, rain, and fertility, may have served as a unifying religious figure that transcended local traditions. The cult of Kukulkan possibly provided ideological support for the more collective political systems of the Postclassic. Human sacrifice, while present in the Classic period, became more prominent and public during the Postclassic. The Tzompantli, or skull rack, at Chichen Itza displayed the skulls of sacrificial victims, a practice more common in central Mexico than in the classic Maya region. These displays of sacrificial victims served both religious and political purposes, demonstrating the power of rulers to capture and sacrifice enemies while feeding the gods with human blood. Artistic styles of the early Postclassic show both continuity and change from classic traditions. While the tradition of erecting dated stone monuments largely ceased, other art forms flourished. Mural painting experienced a renaissance, with sites like Chichen Itza and later Tulum producing elaborate wall paintings. These murals often depicted narrative scenes of battles, ceremonies, and mythological events, providing valuable insights into post-classic society and beliefs. Metallurgy, virtually unknown in the classic period, was introduced during the early Postclassic. Gold, silver, and copper objects, often produced using techniques from lower Central America and Colombia, appear in post-classic contexts. These metal objects were primarily ornamental rather than utilitarian, serving as status symbols and ritual objects. The introduction of metallurgy represents one of several new technologies adopted during this period of increased interregional interaction. The production of codices, the bark paper books of the Maya, likely continued during the early Postclassic, though no examples from this period survive. The few existing Maya codices, which date to the late Postclassic, shows strong continuities with classic period writing and iconography, suggesting that scribal traditions were maintained despite the disruptions of the collapse. These books would have been crucial for preserving astronomical knowledge, ritual calendars, and historical traditions. Settlement patterns changed significantly during the early Postclassic. Rather than the dispersed rural populations centered on major ceremonial centers that characterized the Classic period, Postclassic settlements were often more nucleated and defensive. Many sites were located on islands, peninsulas, or hilltops that could be easily defended. Defensive walls became common features of post-classic sites, indicating that warfare remained a persistent threat. The site of Mayapan, which would become the dominant center of the late post-classic, was founded during the early post-classic period. According to later historical traditions, Mayapan was established around 1000 CE as a joint venture between the rulers of Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and other major centers. This collaborative foundation, whether historical or mythological, reflects the more collective political ideologies of the post-classic period. Agricultural practices adapted to the changed conditions of the post-classic. With reduced populations in many areas, less intensive agricultural techniques could be employed. The labor-intensive raised fields and terracing systems of the classic period were often abandoned in favor of less demanding slash-and-burn cultivation. However, in areas of dense population like the northern Yucatan, intensive techniques including houselot gardens and arboriculture remained important. The Maya of the early post-classic maintained extensive connections with other Mesoamerican cultures. Besides the well-documented interactions with central Mexico, the Maya had connections with lower Central America, as evidenced by the presence of Costa Rican and Panamanian pottery and goldwork. These long-distance connections brought new ideas, technologies, and goods into the Maya region, contributing to the cosmopolitan character of post-classic culture. The late post-classic period, extending from 1200 CE to the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, witnessed the final flowering of independent Maya civilization. This era was characterized by political fragmentation, increased commercialization, and the rise of new power centers. Despite the absence of the Grand Pyramids and elaborate inscriptions of the classic period, the late post-classic Maya maintained vibrant cultures, complex political systems, and extensive trade networks that connected them with peoples across Mesoamerica and beyond. Mayapan rose to become the dominant power in the northern Yucatan during the early part of the late post-classic. Founded as a successor to Chichen Itza, which was abandoned around 1200 CE, for reasons that remain unclear, Mayapan controlled much of the northern peninsula for over 2 centuries. The city, surrounded by a defensive wall 9 kilometers in circumference, contained over 4,000 structures within its boundaries, housing a population of perhaps 15,000 people. The architecture of Mayapan, while inspired by Chichen Itza, was generally smaller in scale and less refined in execution. The city's main pyramid, a scaled-down version of Chichen Itza's Castillo, stands only 15 meters high compared to its 30-meter predecessor. This reduction in monumental architecture reflects broader changes in post-classic society, with resources increasingly directed toward commerce and warfare rather than massive construction projects. Political organization at Mayapan followed the multiple system of shared governance, with power distributed among noble families rather than concentrated in a single ruler. The Copan lineage held primary authority but ruled in conjunction with other noble houses. This system created internal tensions that would ultimately lead to the city's downfall. According to indigenous historical accounts, Mayapan was destroyed around 1441 CE in a revolt led by the Xiu lineage against Copan rule, ending centralized authority in the northern Yucatan. Following Mayapan's fall, the northern Yucatan fragmented into 16 independent provinces, each ruled by a Halach Winnick or territorial ruler. These provinces, including Mani, Sotuta, Hocoba, and others, maintained distinct identities and frequently warred with one another. This political fragmentation would later facilitate Spanish conquest, as the conquistadors exploited divisions among Maya polities, playing rival provinces against each other. The eastern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula experienced remarkable growth during the late post-classic. Sites like Tulum, Tanca, and Xcaret became prosperous trading ports, controlling maritime commerce around the peninsula. Tulum, spectacularly situated on cliffs overlooking the Caribbean Sea, was surrounded by walls on 3 sides, with the 4th side protected by the sea cliffs. The city's architecture, while modest compared to classic period monuments, shows a distinctive style with buildings featuring dramatic negative batter, walls that lean outward as they rise, creating a unique visual effect. The murals at Tulum and other East Coast sites provide vivid glimpses into late post-classic religious and economic life. These paintings, executed in a distinctive style that blends Maya and Central Mexican influences, depict deities, merchants, and complex supernatural scenes. The diving god, a figure shown descending head first, appears frequently in East Coast art and may represent the setting sun, Venus, or bee deities associated with honey production, an important local industry. Maritime trade networks during the late post-classic extended from Honduras to the Gulf Coast of Mexico, with Maya merchants serving as intermediaries in a vast commercial system. Christopher Columbus, during his 4th voyage in 1502, encountered a Maya trading canoe off the coast of Honduras. The canoe, described as being as long as a galley and 8 feet wide, carried 25 people along with a cargo that included cotton mantles, copper axes and bells, cacao, obsidian blades and ceramic vessels. This encounter provides a rare European eyewitness account of Maya maritime commerce in action. The highlands of Guatemala experienced significant political and demographic changes during the late post-classic. Groups of Quiche, Kaqchikel, Tzutujil, and other Maya peoples established powerful kingdoms that dominated extensive territories. These highland kingdoms claimed descent from legendary ancestors who had migrated from the Gulf Coast region, bringing with them political and religious traditions that blended Maya and Central Mexican elements. The Quiche kingdom, centered at Cuyumacaj, also known as Utatlan, became the most powerful highland polity, controlling territory from the Pacific coast to the northern highlands. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiche Maya, provides invaluable insights into late post-classic mythology, history, and worldview. This text, preserved through colonial period transcription of earlier oral traditions and possibly hieroglyphic originals, recounts the creation of the world, the adventures of the hero twins, and the history of the Quiche people. The narrative describes multiple world creations and destructions, with humans finally being successfully created from maize dough after failed attempts with mud and wood. These stories, while specific to the Quiche, reflect broader Maya beliefs about the nature of existence and humanity's relationship with the divine. Highland Maya societies of the late post-classic were highly militaristic, with warfare playing a central role in political expansion and social advancement. Warriors who captured enemies in battle could rise in social status, and military prowess became increasingly important for political leadership. Fortified sites became common, with cities located on defensible hilltops surrounded by walls and ditches. The prevalence of fortifications and weapons in archaeological context indicates that warfare was endemic in the late post-classic highlands. Economic specialization reached new levels during the late post-classic. Different regions and communities specialized in producing specific goods for exchange in the broader market system. The highlands produced obsidian tools, jade ornaments, and quetzal feathers. Coastal areas specialized in salt, dried fish, and marine shells. The lowlands produced cotton textiles, honey, and cacao. This economic specialization created interdependencies that linked diverse regions through trade networks. The production and consumption of cacao intensified during the late post-classic, with cacao beans serving as both a prestige beverage and a form of currency throughout Mesoamerica. Cacao orchards in Soconusco, Tabasco, and other regions were highly valued properties, sometimes causing conflicts between polities seeking to control these resources. The preparation and consumption of chocolate remained primarily an elite privilege, with elaborate ceramic vessels specifically designed for frothing and serving the beverage. Religious practices during the late post-classic showed both continuities with earlier periods and significant innovations. The traditional Maya deities continued to be venerated, but new cults and rituals were introduced, often with central Mexican origins. The practice of mass human sacrifice, particularly heart extraction, became more common, especially in the northern Yucatan and highlands. These sacrifices were often conducted atop pyramids in public spectacles that reinforced political authority and religious ideology. The cult of Kukulkan Quetzalcoatl remained important throughout the late Postclassic, with pilgrimage sites dedicated to this deity attracting devotees from across the Maya region. The island of Cozumel off the eastern coast of Yucatan became an important pilgrimage destination dedicated to Ixchel, the goddess of medicine, childbirth, and weaving. Pilgrims travelled from throughout the Maya world to seek the goddess's favour, bringing offerings and participating in ceremonies at her shrines. Manuscript production continued during the late Postclassic, with scribes maintaining the hieroglyphic writing tradition, despite the absence of carved stone monuments. The surviving Maya codices, the Dresden, Madrid, and Paris codices, date to this period and contain astronomical tables, ritual calendars, and religious almanacs. These books demonstrate remarkable continuity in knowledge systems, with astronomical calculations showing that Maya scholars maintained and refined the observations of their classic period predecessors. The Dresden Codex, the most elaborate of the surviving Maya books, contains remarkably accurate astronomical tables, including eclipse predictions and Venus observations. The precision of these calculations indicates that late Postclassic astronomers had access to centuries of accumulated observations and maintained sophisticated mathematical techniques. The Codex also includes almanacs for agricultural activities, suggesting that astronomical knowledge remained closely tied to practical concerns. Social organization during the late Postclassic maintained hierarchical structures, but with increased social mobility compared to the Classic period. Successful merchants could accumulate wealth and influence that rivaled traditional nobles. The Pochteca, professional long-distance traders, formed a distinct social class with their own patron deities, rituals, and legal privileges. These merchants not only conducted trade but also served as spies and diplomats for their home polities. Architecture during the late Postclassic, while generally more modest than Classic period monuments, developed distinctive regional styles. The international style, characterized by flat roofs, columns, and open halls, spread throughout the Maya region and beyond. This architectural style, possibly originating in the Gulf Coast region, facilitated large gatherings and may reflect changes in ritual practices and political organization. Buildings were often decorated with elaborate murals and stucco friezes, compensating for reduced sculptural production. The Mixteca Puebla art style, originating in central Mexico, influenced late Postclassic Maya artistic production. This style, characterized by standardized iconographic elements and a distinctive color palette, appears in murals, codices, and pottery throughout Mesoamerica. The widespread adoption of this style reflects the cosmopolitan nature of late Postclassic culture and the extensive interaction networks that connected diverse regions. Settlement patterns during the late Postclassic varied significantly by region. In the northern lowlands, populations concentrated in walled towns and cities for protection. In the highlands, fortified hilltop sites dominated the landscape. Along the coasts, trading ports controlled strategic locations. Rural populations often lived in dispersed settlements, coming together at central places for markets and ceremonies. This diversity of settlement patterns reflects the varied environmental, economic, and political conditions across the Maya region. Agricultural practices during the late Postclassic adapted to reduced populations and changed social conditions. While intensive techniques like terracing and raised fields were maintained in some areas, many regions reverted to less labor-intensive swidden cultivation. House gardens became increasingly important, with families growing diverse crops in small plots near their residences. The cultivation of European-introduced crops would later be easily integrated into these existing garden systems. The role of women in late Postclassic society is better documented than in earlier periods, thanks to colonial-era accounts that describe indigenous practices. Women played crucial roles in textile production, one of the most important economic activities. They controlled household economies, participated in market exchange, and served as priestesses and healers. Noble women maintained political influence through marriage alliances and control of property. The goddess Ixchel's prominence in late post-classic religion may reflect the important economic and social roles of women. Environmental management during the late post-classic shows both continuities and changes from earlier periods. With reduced populations in many areas following the classic collapse, forest regeneration occurred in previously cultivated lands. The Maya of this period practiced selective forest management, maintaining useful trees while clearing others for cultivation. Hunting remained important, with deer, peccary and other game providing protein supplements to agricultural diets. The management of coastal resources, including fish weirs and turtle hunting, became increasingly sophisticated. The production of cotton textiles emerged as one of the most important industries of the late post-classic. Cotton, grown primarily in the northern lowlands, was spun into thread and woven into cloth that served both local needs and long-distance trade. Textiles functioned as currency, tribute payments, and elite gifts. The quality and decoration of textiles marked social status, with elaborate designs and rare dyes reserved for nobility. Spanish colonial sources describe the remarkable variety and quality of Maya textiles, including garments decorated with feathers, rabbit fur, and complex brocaded designs. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors in the early 16th century marked the beginning of the end for independent Maya civilization, though the conquest of the Maya lands would prove far more difficult and protracted than the Spanish victories over the Aztec and Inca empires. Unlike those centralized empires, the politically fragmented Maya required numerous military campaigns over many decades, with some regions maintaining independence well into the colonial period. The story of contact and conquest is one of devastating disease, military conflict, cultural resilience, and adaptation that would transform but not destroy Maya civilization. The first sustained contact between Europeans and the Maya occurred in 1511, when a Spanish ship wrecked off the coast of Jamaica, with survivors drifting to the Yucatan coast. Most were sacrificed or died in captivity, but two survivors, Gonzalo Guerrero and Geronimo de Aguilar, lived among the Maya for years. Guerrero married a Maya woman, had children, and became a military leader, later fighting against Spanish expeditions. Aguilar, rescued by Hernán Cortés in 1519, served as a translator during the conquest of Mexico. These contrasting fates, one man going native, the other facilitating conquest, symbolize the complex dynamics of cultural contact. Francisco Hernández de Córdoba's 1517 expedition marked the beginning of Spanish exploration of the Maya region. Landing on the coast of Yucatan, the expedition encountered Maya cities far more impressive than the simple villages the Spanish had found in the Caribbean. The Maya initially received the Spanish peacefully, but conflicts soon erupted. At Champotón, Maya warriors attacked the Spanish expedition, killing 50 men and wounding many others, including Córdoba himself, who died from his injuries shortly after returning to Cuba. This fierce resistance foreshadowed the difficulties the Spanish would face in conquering the Maya. The expedition of Juan de Grijalva in 1518 explored more of the Yucatan coast, establishing that it was a peninsula rather than an island as initially believed. Grijalva's expedition collected gold and other valuable items through trade and plunder, whetting Spanish appetite for conquest. The reports of stone cities, gold ornaments, and dense populations convinced Spanish authorities that the Maya lands were worth conquering, setting in motion the campaigns that would follow. Hernán Cortés passed through the Maya region in 1519 en route to conquering the Aztec Empire, but his impact was minimal except for rescuing Aguilar, who would prove invaluable as a translator. It was Cortés's lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado who led the first major campaign to conquer the Maya. In 1523, fresh from the conquest of Tenochtitlan, Alvarado marched into the Guatemala highlands with a force of Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous Mexican allies. The conquest of the highland Maya kingdoms proved bloody, but relatively swift. Alvarado exploited divisions between the Quiché and Kaqchikel kingdoms, initially allying with the Kaqchikel against their rivals. The Quiché made a stand at their capital of Cumarcaj, but Spanish cavalry, steel weapons, and firearms proved decisive, The Quiche's ruler Teconuman died in battle, later becoming a legendary figure in Maya folklore. Alvarado burned Q'umarcaj and established the Spanish capital of Santiago de los Caballeros, modern Antigua Guatemala. The Kaqchikel initially welcomed the Spanish as allies against the Quiche, but Spanish demands for gold and labor soon turned them into enemies. The Kaqchikel abandoned their capital of Iximchi and waged a guerrilla war against the Spanish for several years. Other highland groups, including the Tzutujil, Mam, and Pocomam, resisted Spanish conquest with varying degrees of success. The mountainous terrain of the highlands favored defensive warfare, and some regions remained unconquered for decades. The conquest of the Yucatan Peninsula proved even more challenging than the highlands. Francisco de Montejo, granted a royal charter to conquer Yucatan, launched his first campaign in 1527. This initial attempt failed miserably, with Maya resistance, disease, and lack of supplies forcing the Spanish to withdraw. Montejo's second campaign, beginning in 1531, established a foothold in the peninsula but again failed to achieve lasting conquest. The Maya of Yucatan, though politically divided, united in their resistance to Spanish invasion. It wasn't until Montejo's son, Francisco de Montejo the Younger, launched a third campaign in 1540 that the Spanish finally established permanent control over parts of Yucatan. Even then the conquest was incomplete. The Spanish founded Mérida in 1542 on the ruins of the Maya city of Tahoe, and Valladolid in 1543, but large areas remained outside Spanish control. The eastern coast, the forests of the interior, and the Petén region of Guatemala maintained independence for generations. Disease proved to be the Spanish's most devastating weapon, though they didn't fully understand its impact. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and other Old World diseases to which the Maya had no immunity swept through indigenous populations in successive epidemics. The first major smallpox epidemic, arriving even before the Spanish themselves, killed untold thousands in 1520. Subsequent epidemics in 1531, 1545, and 1562 further decimated populations. Some regions lost 90% or more of their indigenous population within a century of contact. The demographic catastrophe caused by disease had profound social and cultural impacts beyond the immediate death toll. Entire communities disappeared. Traditional knowledge was lost as elders died, and social structures collapsed. Agricultural systems that required communal labor became impossible to maintain. The psychological impact of watching families and communities destroyed by incomprehensible diseases undermined traditional religious beliefs and social cohesion, facilitating Spanish conquest and conversion efforts. Spanish colonial administration imposed new political structures on Maya communities. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists the right to indigenous labor and tribute from specific communities. In return, encomenderos was supposedly responsible for protecting and converting their charges to Christianity, though in practice the system often amounted to brutal exploitation. Maya communities were reorganized into Spanish-style municipalities, with appointed indigenous officials who served as intermediaries between their communities and Spanish authorities. The Catholic Church played a central role in colonial transformation of Maya society. Franciscan and Dominican missionaries arrived soon after military conquest, establishing churches and monasteries throughout Maya lands. The early missionaries, particularly Franciscan friar Diego de Landa in Yucatan, pursued aggressive conversion campaigns. Landa's auto da fe at Mani in 1562, where he burned thousands of Maya books and religious objects, represents one of history's great acts of cultural destruction. Ironically, Landa later wrote the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, one of our most important sources on Maya culture, perhaps partly in penance for his earlier destruction. Maya responses to Christianity varied considerably, some genuinely converted finding parallels between Christian and Maya religious concepts. Others practiced superficial conversion while maintaining traditional beliefs in private. Still others synthesized Christian and Maya elements, creating new religious traditions that persist today. The identification of Christian saints with Maya deities, the continuation of agricultural rituals under Christian guises, and the maintenance of sacred calendars alongside the Christian calendar all demonstrate Maya agency in shaping their colonial experience. The Spanish introduced new crops, animals and technologies that transformed Maya agriculture and economy. Cattle, horses, pigs, and chickens provided new protein sources but also competed with humans for land and resources. Wheat, sugarcane, and citrus fruits diversified agricultural production. Steel tools made clearing land easier but also accelerated deforestation. The introduction of European diseases to domesticated animals sometimes spread to wild populations, affecting hunting resources. Colonial economic exploitation took multiple forms. Besides labor obligations under the encomienda system, the Maya faced tribute payments in goods or currency, forced labor on public works projects, and obligations to provide goods at below-market prices to Spanish officials. The cultivation of indigo and cacao for export markets transformed some regions into monoculture plantations. The extraction of logwood for dye production led to the deforestation of coastal regions. These economic pressures forced many Maya into debt peonage, a form of bondage that would persist into the 20th century. Despite colonial oppression, Maya communities demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptation. They quickly adopted Spanish legal mechanisms to defend their interests, filing lawsuits to protect communal lands and limit tribute obligations. Maya scribes learned to write their languages in Latin script, producing documents that preserved historical traditions and protected community rights. The books of Chilambalam, written in Yucatec Maya using Latin letters, combined pre-Columbian historical traditions with colonial-era observations and prophecies. Maya rebellions against colonial rule occurred regularly throughout the colonial period. The Great Maya Revolt of 1546 to 1547 in Yucatan nearly succeeded in expelling the Spanish from the peninsula. Led by indigenous priests and nobles, the rebellion united diverse Maya groups in coordinated attacks on Spanish settlements. Only the arrival of Spanish reinforcements from central Mexico prevented a complete Spanish defeat. Smaller rebellions and resistance movements continued throughout the colonial period, maintaining pressure on Spanish authority. The persistence of independent Maya groups in frontier regions provided alternatives to colonial domination. The Itza kingdom, centered at Tayasal in Lake Chichen maintained independence until 1697, nearly 2 centuries after initial Spanish contact. The Lacandon Maya of the Chiapas rainforest successfully resisted conquest throughout the colonial period. These independent groups provided refuge for Maya fleeing colonial oppression and maintained traditional practices that influenced broader Maya culture. Colonial-era Maya maintained extensive trade networks that sometimes operated outside Spanish control. Salt, cacao, cotton, and other goods continued to be exchanged through traditional routes and markets. Smuggling became common, with Maya traders avoiding Spanish taxes and regulations. Coastal communities maintained maritime trade with British settlements in Belize and other non-Spanish territories. These economic activities provided some degree of autonomy within the colonial system. The social fabric of Maya civilization, woven through 3 millennia of cultural development, created one of the most complex and sophisticated societies in the ancient world. From the humble farmer tending maize fields to the divine king performing world-renewing rituals atop pyramids, Maya society encompassed a rich diversity of roles, relationships, and experiences. Understanding how the Maya organized their communities, practiced their faith, and lived their daily lives reveals the human dimension of this remarkable civilization. Maya social hierarchy was complex and multifaceted, with distinctions based not only on birth but also on occupation, achievement, and ritual knowledge. At the apex stood the Kuhula Jau, the holy lord whose person embodied the connection between human and divine realms. These rulers weren't merely political leaders but were considered divine or semi-divine beings, whose actions maintained cosmic order. The blood of kings was sacred, containing a divine essence called Kuhul that connected them to the gods and ancestors. This sacred quality was inherited, making royal bloodlines the fundamental organizing principle of Maya politics. Below the ruler, the royal family held tremendous privilege and responsibility. Royal siblings, children and cousins filled important administrative and religious positions. Royal women, far from being mere ornaments, played crucial political roles through marriage alliances, regency for young rulers, and sometimes direct rule. Lady Six Sky of Naranjo, Lady Evening Star of Yaxchilan, and other royal women demonstrated that gender, while certainly significant in Maya society, didn't absolutely preclude political power. The nobility, called a Hawab, formed a complex hierarchy of their own. High nobles might rule subsidiary sites, command military forces, or oversee important religious ceremonies. They distinguished themselves through exclusive access to certain goods and knowledge. Jade ornaments, Quetzal feathers, jaguar pelts, and the ability to read and write hieroglyphs. Noble titles were often inherited but could also be earned through military achievement or religious service. The elaborate titles recorded in hieroglyphic texts, he of 20 captives, guardian of the royal crown, speaker for the king, indicate the specialization and complexity of noble roles. Priests formed another crucial segment of elite society, though the boundary between political and religious authority was fluid. High priests might be members of the royal family, and rulers themselves performed important priestly functions. Priests were responsible for maintaining the complex calendar systems, performing divination, conducting sacrifices, and preserving religious and historical knowledge. They underwent extensive training, including periods of isolation, fasting, and bloodletting that prepared them for their sacred duties. The knowledge they protected, astronomical observations, medicinal preparations, ritual procedures, was considered too powerful for common people to possess. Scribes and artists occupied a special position in Maya society, creating the physical manifestations of elite culture. Many scribes were themselves nobles, and some signed their works with elaborate titles indicating their high status. The production of hieroglyphic texts, painted ceramics, and carved monuments required not just technical skill but deep cultural knowledge. Artists had to understand complex mythologies, astronomical cycles, and historical traditions to create works that properly conveyed their intended meanings. Warriors formed another important social group, with military achievement providing one of the few paths for social advancement. Successful warriors who captured enemies in battle could earn titles, land grants, and the right to wear certain ornaments. The highest military honors went to those who captured noble enemies for sacrifice. Warriors trained from childhood in the use of weapons and military tactics. Elite warriors might serve as palace guards or form special military orders with distinctive costumes and privileges. Merchants, particularly the long-distance traders called polum, occupied an interesting position between elite and commoner society. Successful merchants could accumulate significant wealth and influence, sometimes rivaling nobles in their displays of luxury goods. They had their own patron deities, conducted their own ceremonies, and in some periods and places formed powerful guilds that negotiated with political authorities. The knowledge required for long-distance trade, understanding multiple languages, knowing safe routes, maintaining commercial relationships, made merchants valuable to rulers seeking exotic goods and intelligence about foreign lands. Craftspeople and specialists formed the middle ranks of Maya society. These included potters, weavers, stone workers, feather workers, and other artisans who produced both utilitarian and luxury goods. Many crafts were organized by families or neighborhoods, with skills passed from generation to generation. The quality of Maya craftsmanship, even in everyday objects, indicates that artisans took pride in their work and that consumers valued well-made goods. Some craftspeople achieved sufficient recognition to sign their works or receive special commissions from elite patrons. The majority of Maya society consisted of farmers and laborers who produced the agricultural surpluses and provided the labor that supported the entire system. These commoners, called Chembal Winikub, weren't an undifferentiated mass but had their own internal hierarchies and organizations. Some owned land, while others worked as tenants or laborers. Extended families often worked together, pooling labor for agricultural tasks and construction projects. Despite their low formal status, commoners participated in religious ceremonies, attended markets, and maintained their own cultural traditions. Slavery existed in Maya society, though it differed from the chattel slavery of other civilizations. Slaves, called Pentecob, might be war captives, criminals, debtors, or orphans. Slavery wasn't necessarily permanent or hereditary. Slaves could be ransomed, could purchase their freedom, or might be freed upon their owner's death. Some slaves served in households, while others laboured in fields or construction projects. The children of slaves and free persons were considered free, preventing the formation of a permanent slave caste. Family structure formed the basic organising unit of Maya society. Extended families, including grandparents, parents, children, and often married siblings with their families, lived in residential compounds, consisting of multiple structures around a central patio. These household groups shared resources, labour, and ritual obligations. Marriage was generally monogamous for commoners, though elite men might have multiple wives. Marriage alliances between elite families created political networks that could span entire regions. Gender roles in Maya society were complementary rather than strictly hierarchical. Men typically engaged in farming, hunting, construction, and warfare, while women managed households, wove textiles, prepared food, and tended gardens. However, these divisions weren't absolute. Women participated in agricultural labour during peak seasons, and men assisted with domestic tasks. Both genders participated in market exchange, religious ceremonies, and community decision-making, though usually in different capacities. Childhood in Maya society involved gradual incorporation into adult roles and responsibilities. Children began helping with age-appropriate tasks from an early age, learning by observation and practice. Boys accompanied fathers to fields, gradually learning agricultural techniques and craft skills. Girls worked alongside mothers, learning food preparation, weaving, and household management. Formal education was limited to elite children, who might study writing, calendar systems, and religious knowledge with priests or scribes. The life cycle of the Maya was marked by elaborate ceremonies that marked transitions between social states. Birth rituals included the burial of the umbilical cord in the house floor or field, connecting the child to place and family. Coming-of-age ceremonies marked the transition from childhood to adulthood, often involving painful ordeals that tested courage and commitment. Marriage ceremonies created not just bonds between individuals but alliances between families. Death rituals, which varied by social status, ensured the deceased's successful journey to the afterlife. Maya religion permeated every aspect of daily life, from the grandest state ceremonies to the simplest household rituals. The Maya cosmos was inhabited by hundreds of deities, each with specific attributes, responsibilities, and demands. These gods weren't distant, abstract beings, but active participants in human affairs who required constant attention through prayers, offerings, and sacrifices. The boundaries between natural and supernatural, human and divine, living and dead, were permeable and constantly negotiated through ritual action. The Maya pantheon included deities of natural phenomena, occupations, and abstract concepts. Chak, the rain god, was particularly important given the dependence on rainfall agriculture. Depicted with a long nose and fangs, Chak was both beneficent provider of life-giving rain and dangerous bringer of destructive floods. The maize god, shown as a beautiful young man with corn-silk hair, embodied the crop that provided the majority of calories in the Maya diet. Ixchel, the moon goddess, presided over weaving, childbirth, and medicine. Apuch, the death god, ruled the lowest level of the underworld. Religious ceremonies range from simple household offerings to elaborate public spectacles. Every morning, families made offerings of incense, food, or flowers to household shrines. Agricultural activities required specific rituals. Ceremonies before clearing fields, prayers during planting, offerings at harvest. Community ceremonies marked the solar year, with festivals celebrating the rains, the harvest, and the renewal of time. State ceremonies, conducted by rulers and high priests, involved elaborate costumes, music, dancing, and often human sacrifice. Bloodletting formed a central component of Maya religious practice. The Maya believed blood contained chulel, a sacred life force that could nourish gods and open portals to supernatural realms. Rulers and nobles regularly performed auto-sacrifice, piercing their tongues, earlobes, or genitals with stingray spines, obsidian blades, or thorny cords. The blood was collected on bark paper and burned, the smoke carrying the offering to the gods. These painful rituals demonstrated piety, courage, and the ruler's willingness to suffer for their people's benefit. Human sacrifice, while not as common as popular imagination suggests, played important roles in Maya religion. Captive warriors might be sacrificed to commemorate building dedications, royal accessions, or period endings in the calendar. Methods included decapitation, heart extraction, drowning, and shooting with arrows. The victims weren't always unwilling. Some may have considered sacrifice an honor that guaranteed a favorable afterlife. Children were sometimes sacrificed to rain gods, their tears symbolically bringing rain. The ball game served religious as well as recreational and political functions. The game reenacted the myth of the hero twins, who defeated the lords of the underworld in a ball game. The ball's movement represented the sun's journey through the underworld, and keeping it in motion ensured the sun's daily rebirth. Games might serve as divination, with outcomes interpreted as divine will. Important games might end with the sacrifice of players, though this was likely reserved for special occasions rather than routine matches. Maya concepts of the soul and afterlife were complex and varied. The Maya believed in multiple souls or soul components, including a life force that animated the body, a breath soul that departed at death, and a personal essence that continued after death. The afterlife destination depended on manner of death rather than moral conduct. Warriors who died in battle, women who died in childbirth, and sacrificial victims went to paradise. Those who died of natural causes faced a difficult journey through the underworld, though proper burial rituals could ease their passage. Dreams and visions played crucial roles in Maya religious experience. Through fasting, bloodletting, and consumption of hallucinogens, religious practitioners sought visions of gods and ancestors. These vision quests provided divine guidance for important decisions and validated political authority. The vision serpent, a supernatural entity that appeared during bloodletting rituals, served as a conduit for communication with the divine. Depictions of vision serpents in Maya art often show ancestors or deities emerging from the serpent's mouth. Sacred geography shaped Maya religious practice and community organization. Natural features like caves, mountains, and bodies of water were considered portals to supernatural realms. Caves, in particular, were seen as entrances to the underworld and sites of creation. Many Maya cities were built near significant caves, and artificial caves were sometimes created beneath pyramids. Mountains were the homes of gods and ancestors, and pyramids served as artificial mountains that brought sacred space into the human realm. The calendar systems that regulated Maya religious and social life were remarkably complex, interweaving multiple cycles of different lengths. The 260-day ritual calendar, the Solkin, combined 20-day names with 13 numbers to create a cycle that governed divination, ceremonies, and personal destiny. The 365-day Harb provided the agricultural and solar calendar. The long count tracked historical time from a mythological creation date. The correlation of these calendars created a rich temporal framework that gave meaning to every day. Daily life for most Maya revolved around agricultural activities that followed the rhythm of seasons. The agricultural cycle began with the selection and clearing of fields in the dry season. Farmers used slash-and-burn techniques, cutting vegetation and burning it to release nutrients into the soil. Planting occurred just before the rainy season, with ceremonies to ensure Chak's favor. Maize, beans, and squash were planted together in a complementary system that maximized yields and maintained soil fertility. Weeding and tending crops occupied the rainy season, while harvest in the fall required intensive communal labor. The Maya diet, while centered on maize, beans, and squash, included remarkable variety. Maize was prepared in numerous ways, ground into flour for tortillas and tamales, boiled for atole porridge, fermented for alcoholic beverages. Beans provided essential protein, while squash offered vitamins and minerals. Chili peppers added flavor and important nutrients. The Maya cultivated numerous other crops: tomatoes, sweet potatoes, manioc, chaya, and various fruits. Wild resources supplemented agriculture. Hunting provided deer, peccary, tapir, and birds. Fishing yielded numerous species. Gathering supplied nuts, fruits, and honey. Maya cuisine was sophisticated and varied by region and social class. Commoners ate simple meals of tortillas, beans, and vegetables flavored with chili and herbs. Elites enjoyed elaborate dishes including turkey and rich sauces, seafood, and chocolate beverages. Food preparation was time-consuming, particularly the daily grinding of maize on stone metates. Women spent several hours daily preparing meals, a labor-intensive process that was nevertheless central to family and social life. Communal feasting played important social and religious roles, reinforcing social bonds and hierarchies. Housing varied dramatically by social status and regional traditions. Elite residences were multi-room stone structures with plastered walls and floors, sometimes decorated with murals. These houses were often built on raised platforms and arranged around courtyards that provided private space for family activities. Commoner houses were typically single-room structures with thatched roofs, walls of poles and mud, and dirt floors. Despite their simplicity, these houses were well adapted to the tropical climate, providing protection from rain while allowing air circulation. Clothing and personal adornment marked social status and cultural identity. Elite men wore elaborate costumes including loincloths, capes, sandals, and headdresses decorated with feathers, jade, and shell. Elite women wore long dresses or skirts with decorated huipil blouses. Commoners dressed more simply, with men wearing simple loincloths and women wearing plain skirts and blouses. Body modification was common across social classes. Cranial deformation created the elongated head shape considered beautiful. Dental modification included filing and jade inlays, and tattooing and scarification marked achievement and identity. Trade and markets formed essential components of Maya economic and social life. Regular markets in plaza areas brought together producers and consumers for exchange of goods and social interaction. Market days were social occasions where people from surrounding communities gathered to trade, share news, and maintain relationships. Professional merchants transported valuable goods between markets, creating networks that connected diverse regions. The use of standardized currencies, including cacao beans and other valuable items, facilitated complex economic transactions. Entertainment and leisure activities provided relief from daily labor and reinforced social bonds. Besides the ball game, the Maya enjoyed music, dancing, and storytelling. Archaeological evidence of musical instruments includes drums, flutes, rattles, and trumpets. Ceramic figurines depict dancers in elaborate costumes. Storytelling preserved historical traditions and mythological knowledge, with professional storytellers entertaining audiences with tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors. Board games, including a game similar to Pachisi, provided entertainment for all social classes. The enduring legacy of Maya civilization extends far beyond ancient ruins and museum artifacts. Today, over 6 million Maya people maintain their languages, traditions, and cultural identity, despite centuries of oppression and marginalization. Modern Maya communities continue agricultural practices developed by their ancestors, maintain sacred calendars alongside the Gregorian calendar, and preserve mythological traditions that connect them to their remarkable past. The resilience and continuity of Maya culture remind us that this is not a dead civilization, but a living tradition that continues to evolve and adapt.